I've told everybody on this channel continuously to know your market. But what if I told you that knowing your market involves simply just more than which metropolitan area you're located in? I want to get this down to a granular level here real quick because I think it makes a big difference in how much money you could make, profit, or otherwise expend on this venture called gig app delivery, food delivery. And so let me get this down to a granular level. I'm going to use myself as an example first. I'm just going to kind of drill this down. So I operate out of the Twin Cities metropolitan market in Minnesota. Now, okay, so now to get this down a little bit more granular, you want to get your market down a little bit more to your immediate locality, which in my case is the city of Forest Lake, which is about 35 miles north of downtown Minneapolis and 30 miles north of downtown St. Paul. Population 20,000. We don't have the urban density out here that they do in the twin downtowns. Those areas are much more densely populated. They have a much more dense concentration of restaurants and eateries than we do up here. If you ever look at Interstate 35 on a map, you'll notice that Interstate 35 splits into a 35W through Minneapolis and a 35E through St. Paul. Forest Lake is the point at which the two 35s meet on the north end of the metropolitan area. So from here, you can take 35W into downtown Minneapolis or 35E into downtown St. Paul. Now, this is what is called an ex-urban market. Ex-urban is areas that are on the fringes of metropolitan areas that do have some suburban characteristics to them, but are otherwise, they're surrounded by rural areas and they have rural characteristics as well. So we have characteristics that are both urban or suburban and rural. We're not urban by any stretch of the imagination because we're too far from the Minnesota urban centers. So how does this impact my earning ability? Well, this is also to partially answer a question about whether you can do this full time. Up here, you cannot. Population of only 20,000 in a trade market area of about 50,000, which is how many people depend on Forest Lake for major services. So for example, if you're doing Spark, you're doing Walmart shopping, Forest Lake is the center of an area of about 50,000 people total, over a couple hundred square miles. There are smaller towns that are scattered in this area, which serve as, areas with population, some population. So let me name some of these smaller towns around us. 10 miles east of downtown of Forest Lake, the center, is a town called Scandia. Population about 4,000. They order all of their food deliveries and the Walmart, Sparks deliveries from Forest Lake. 3 miles north of us is a smaller town called Wyoming. Wyoming's population is about 8,000. Wyoming residents also order almost all of the restaurant food from Forest Lake. Wyoming does have a McDonald's, but other than that, their food delivery comes exclusively from Forest Lake. Population 8,000. Their Walmart deliveries same. Now Uber does not focus heavily in these external areas. Now, west of here, almost adjacent to our west, is a rural city which is called Columbus. It's a township that incorporated itself into a city government, even though it's almost entirely rural. It has an overall population of about 4,000. They order everything from Forest Lake. And those drives go up typically about 5 to 7 miles outside of the Forest Lake Center. So that is one town. Another one, which is a suburb, more of a suburb to our immediate south, closer to St. Paul, is called Hugo. Population 11,000. They are actually part of the DoorDash Forest Lake zone. The advantage of driving to Hugo on DoorDash, again, is that you can oftentimes get a a trip back north towards Forest Lake. It's the only neighboring town in which this is the case. The only town in the market area in which you can have a chance of getting a trip down and also getting a trip back. Hugo has a notable restaurant center of its own. And that's why you can get the trips back northbound. Hugo is a few miles down 35E, south of the split, and it's on the way again to St. Paul. Population of 11,000. Many of our Walmart, Spark, and pet food delivery orders go to Hugo. And again, it's much more suburban in character than Forest Lake is. Forest Lake is ex-urban with a lot of rural areas around it. Forest Lake, by the way, the city of Forest Lake, population 20,000, was formed by a merger of the city of Forest Lake and the surrounding Forest Lake Township. That's why much of the city limits is rural in character, but there is a town center, and again, that town center has a Walmart, a Target. Many of your chain restaurants are in the original Forest Lake city limits center. It has an Applebee's, it has a Perkins, it has every major fast food chain imaginable. So you have to be aware of your miles on where your trips are going. Again, many of these trips go outside of the city. Oh, and another area of towns that is to our immediate northeast is about 7 to 15 miles northeast of us down US Highway 8. They're called the Chisago Lakes towns, or the Chisago Lakes area. They are on a series of a chain of lakes northeast on Highway 8. Chisago City has a population of about 5,000. Neighboring Lindstrom, which is the next town out, also has a population of about 5 to 6,000. The third town to the immediate east is actually called Center City. It has a population of only about 700. It's a small town, but it is on a lake, part of one of the Chisago Lakes. These three towns to our northeast have a population of about 11,000. But again, a lot of areas in those town limits are very rural, particularly Chisago City, which covers a large area, but the town center itself has maybe a couple thousand in it. There is a McDonald's and an Arby's, both in Chisago City. There's a well-known bar and grill in Chisago City. If you get a trip out there, it can occasionally result in a trip back towards Forest Lake, but not very often. Center City, as irony would have it, is actually a county seat. Despite its tiny population, it is the county seat of Chisago County, which is our neighbors to the north and east. It has a county building and a courthouse overlooking one of the lakes. It's a very scenic area. I like deliveries to this area almost for my own mental health. I like a lot of these deliveries for my own mental health for this reason. So that explains my suburban. The suburban part is Forest Lake, the original Forest Lake proper. The rest of it is ex-urban. Ex-urban, of course, meaning on the outer fringes of a metropolitan area with some suburban characteristics, but mostly rural characteristics. The reason why this makes a difference in how much money you can make is the expenses. I've talked about expenses constantly. So if you're in an area like this, you can get a decent number of orders from Forest Lake City Center, or even from Hugo or from Chisago City. But the problem is your expenses run very high up here. You have to be constantly aware of this in every trip. Thus, my vehicle expenses are starting 2 cents per mile, but my break-even point is typically $1.44 per mile, because you're taking the original trip and you're doubling the miles, because you know you have to come back empty. Most of the times, except for the exceptions I've mentioned earlier in this video, you can occasionally get those, but it doesn't happen very often. Now, talking about the type of market that is a dense urban center. So say I operated in the city of Minneapolis or the city of St. Paul. Those have very heavy populations. You can go from stop to stop without consideration for return miles, because a lot of your trips will keep you within the, on DoorDash, for example, the city of Minneapolis itself is a zone. The city of St. Paul itself is a zone. So if you make your trips out of Minneapolis or St. Paul restaurants, you're going to a Minneapolis or St. Paul residence the lion's share of the time. Occasionally you may leave the city limits, but if you do, you're not going very far to get back. You're not doing what you're doing up here in Forest Lake, which is making a long trip to double your miles to get back into your zone. That doesn't happen down there. So you don't have to double your miles. You're considering a much lower expense outlay than you are in an ex-urban region such as mine. The reason why I can't really don't like going all the way down there is for the reason that the driving is much more stressful in the core cities themselves than it is up here. With these country drives, it's a lot more peaceful. It's a lot less risky to my vehicle, a lot less likely to get into an accident. Unfortunately, if you do up here, you're doing it at a pretty high speed. But in Minneapolis City proper, you're much more likely to hit your fender benders, have people running traffic lights in a dense urban center with heavy amounts of traffic. So consider that. But I don't like going down there for the stressful reasons. I'm also having to consider the 35-mile drive into Minneapolis as an expense in and of its own right. So this eats at the profits that I make in the city. But you live in a city like that, you're already there, you're going to make a higher profit margin than you will up there. But again, you may not make quite as much gross, but your expenses will be lower. So is this feasible as a full-time job in an urban center with higher volumes and lower expenses? Quite possibly. Your market's going to be a little bit different. I would highly suggest analyzing this accordingly. Now, a pure suburban market. So around here, that would be not even an inner ring suburb, but let's say a second-tier suburb, such as Roseville or Minnetonka. Something that doesn't necessarily border Minneapolis directly, but is fairly close in. These are your suburban markets with a very heavy restaurant concentration. So the amount of business that you can get in these areas is very good. Now, out in a place like Minnetonka, for example, which is to our west, Minnetonka has a great array of restaurants to pick up from, but it does have a considerably higher distance to the destination, to the delivery points, than inside of the city of Minneapolis. You deliver in Minnetonka, you're talking about a few miles, but not to the level that they are up here in Forest Lake. That's a pure suburban market. That's a middle of the road market, kind of not as stressful, but it can be because you may be on major freeways, or in the case of Minnetonka, Interstate 394 or Interstate 494. You may be involved with some of that in order to get to your delivery areas, which are, again, suburban locations. So you want to consider that. For test driving the specific areas to see which type of specific market you're in, I would suggest a test drive of it. Do it for a couple of days and see how this falls, how your expenses fall, how your volumes come in, and how your expenses come out. Nobody on a Facebook forum is going to be able to answer generally what your feasibility of your specific market happens to be, because they don't know your specific location. Nobody out there does. You have to test drive this for yourself. Don't come to Facebook looking for easy answers, because they can't be had. Even if you get one, it's likely to be wrong. As I've said before in previous videos, you can't be lazy in this gig. You have to put in the work to make your own market determinations, just as I have with the Forest Lake region here in the far north edge of the Twin Cities metropolitan area. Do the work. Do it that way. figure out which category this happens to fall into, or if it's some blended version of these categories, that could exist too. Your localities may differ depending on location. So I'll call this good for now. I will leave this in one of the threads where they're asking about doing this full time. Hopefully this can answer it, because you will need to find your own answer. Don't let anybody else's experiences make this determination for you, because it's likely to be wrong. So you folks have an excellent day, and again, peace out, homies.